Hello, Vermonters. It is Zachary Hampl once again from Rutland County. And before I get too far into this video, I would like to give a very special recognition and very special thank you to CCTV for the staff here for allowing me to return to make this secondary video on the secondary broadcast. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to have their support. The last time that I was here, in terms of announcing my candidacy for the Treasurer of the State of Vermont, I spent quite a bit of time talking about bond ratings, estimations, talked about tax-supported debt, and how we were able to equate some of those things to the simulations that we had that were done entirely online. And I actually would like to thank a number of viewers out there who have been supporting the campaign ever since I first publicly announced that I was running for the Treasurer of the State of Vermont. That video on YouTube has been viewed over 200 times, and so I just want to say thank you so very much to every single supporter of the campaign that's out there, because quite literally I would not be able to do this had it not been for your support and for your encouragement to run for this office. Kind of picking up from where we left off with the last video today, what I would like to do is talk much more in detail about the power of teamwork, specifically as it relates to the legislature, and then to take things even further, to not just harness the power of teamwork, but also pick up from where I left off as well in terms of collaborations and coalitions, so that way we can at last begin to not only work with the legislature one-on-one in terms of balancing communication, but also have the power of teamwork work much more in favor for all Vermonters. And that's the real reason why I'm here today. So very similar to last time, what I essentially have is a presentation and a couple of different slides, couple of different charts that are to help illustrate a number of different talking points that I'd like to have fully addressed. And I do want to understood, very similar to the last time that I was here, I will not be able to go through every single detail as much as I was able to last time. But be all that as it may, I do want to understood that every single video and every single presentation that I can give, I can only provide so much information in only one setting. So I do want that to be fully understood that this is not a end-all, be-all perfect solution, but I'm still very optimistic about being able to present this information here for you today. So beginning things right off the bat with teamwork. We know for a fact that the legislature, as we talked about last time, are made entirely of human beings. And they're not just any human beings, they are also Vermonters. And that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, that they come from different walks of life. And their backgrounds and their walks of life is essentially what makes them who they are to this very day. And that's how, in a lot of cases, that's how we end up with members of the legislature that are very conservative or very, very liberal. And of course, as you would rightfully expect, that is a source for where the communication can in fact go out of balance among all members of the legislature. And so that's why, in terms of championing the power of teamwork, it's one thing to talk about the power of teamwork. However, there is another factor that goes into that in terms of finding common ground. This is by far one of the most important things that I believe that the Treasurer's Office, which is not a policymaking position to begin with, can do to work with the legislature and not just champion the power of teamwork, but also be able to build not just coalitions, but also collaborations that result in the formation, as I mentioned the last time that I was here, a collaborative banking system. And that's essentially where I'd like to begin this presentation here today. So what I essentially have are some screenshots that are based on the Vermont Progressive Party's overall beliefs. And what I did was I took some screenshots from their website and I was looking at all of their beliefs, all of their all their core beliefs that they have, and I was amazed to find out that as it relates to the Treasurer's office, there are definitely areas where I can foresee that the Progressive Party can in fact find common ground in terms of working with all members of the legislature. So I'd like to go through them one by one, but I would also like to go ahead and give you just a little bit more background information to help you understand. So these are again, this is just a screenshot. So let's go right ahead and begin right here. This is their very, very first belief that I was able to find that I can definitely foresee common ground. And then down here, I would encourage you to, there we go. I would encourage you to look at their website for yourself via this URL link. So that way you can know for a fact that these are not my words, these are the words of the Progressive Party. First of all, it says here, quote, "Our country, state, and localities can reach their highest social and economic aspirations through truly representative democracy." Now, can you imagine a single registered Democrat that would be against that kind of a belief? I don't think so. To tell you the truth, I can't imagine a single registered Democrat that would be against that kind of a philosophy. So right off the bat, looking at it from that angle, I submit actually the Progressive Party, they do in fact have quite a bit in common with the Democratic Party. And of course, again, this is the Progressive Party's beliefs for the state of Vermont. And so I do believe very strongly that looking at it from that angle, I submit actually, that is a tremendous way to be able to find common ground with not just the Democratic Party, but all individuals who have what are known as fusion candidates who are either quasi-democratic and progressive or a 50-50 combination of both Democratic and progressive at the exact same time. So the second thing that I would like to see, that I'd like to show you here, all people have a right to equal participation in society. Now, I don't necessarily know how much closer to a libertarian belief the Progressive Party can get than that. And the reason being is because of our Declaration of Independence. So we do, in fact, have the right to life. We have the right to liberties. We have the right to pursuit of happiness. And of course, our Declaration of Independence goes on to list those rights as certain unalienable rights that are endowed to us by our Creator. So where the Libertarian Party picks up is essentially where the Declaration of Independence leaves off in terms of saying that we don't just have these unalienable rights for nothing, we have them for a very, very specific reason. And therefore, we the people, we do in fact have a right to participate in our society and within our country, regardless of our race, our creed, or our background. So once again, the Progressive Party, according to their philosophies that they have on their website, they are off to another tremendous beginning in terms of finding common ground with the Libertarian Party. Now let's look at the next one down here. Democracy requires empowering people, not only in the government, but also in the workplace, schools, and in the overall economy. Once again, I can think of no better place to look for to find common ground between the progressives and the Libertarian Party than that. Because again, they're talking about empowering the people here. This is not necessarily empowering the government, this is empowering the people. And that is essentially how, and the reason why actually, that our country was founded in the way that it was, in terms of championing civil liberties among all human beings. So what that really does is that takes our right to life and our rights to our liberties, brings it to the next level. So looking at it from that angle, I think that is another tremendous point to really focus on in terms of the progressives finding common ground with the Libertarian Party. So once again, the Progressive Party, they are off to a tremendous start in terms of finding common ground. And again, the Treasurer's office is not a policymaking position. And that's another thing that's really, really important to keep in mind, because when we talk about the Treasurer's office being apolitical, purely monetary, purely finance, this is a milestone actually in terms of being able to work with all members of the legislature and recognize that yes, indeed, they are human beings and not robots. So that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, because again, we're talking about working with not just any human beings, but in this case, Vermonters who happen to be elected officials that represent represent the best of Vermonters. And so looking at it from that angle, that's another major area of where working with our legislature as a team player with the Treasurer's Office in terms of making these decisions for investments, these investments should benefit Vermonters, and it should be to the Vermonters' benefits. In order to do that, that's why we have to have the power of teamwork on our side. But in order to have the power of teamwork, we have to find common ground with all sides of the aisle. And so, once again, like I said, the Progressive Party is off to a tremendous beginning at many levels in terms of being able to find common ground with all sides of the aisle. And this election is another major reason why I'm actually very grateful to be running as a third-party candidate, to be able to have the best of both worlds, both from conservative perspectives and from liberal perspectives, and have them find common ground to work in the power of teamwork, but also unity as well. It unites essentially all sides of the aisle. This is not a perfect end-all be-all solution. That's absolutely true. However, it is a stepping stone, because I think we can all agree that the two-party system is just not working in favor of Vermonters, and that's one of the reasons why I'm also here today as well. So let's go ahead and continue down through this chart here. Now this next portion, this is where it gets into a little bit of a gray area, but I do believe that there is a way to be able to combine this overall philosophy with other sides of the aisle as well, more specifically the Republican Party. And it says here, quote, "Society's wealth should not be concentrated in the hands of a few, and a wealthy minority should not control the conditions under which we live." Now, let's think about that just for a moment. This is one of the largest areas that I know of where the Progressive Party and the Republican Party clash. So I want to understood, I do not claim to have a perfect understanding about the philosophies or the backgrounds of either the Progressive Party or the Republican Party. However, in terms of being able to find common ground to balance the communication between both parties, there really is one area in particular that I can think of to be able to translate this philosophy in particular towards becoming more acceptable, more agreeable, particularly with the Republican Party. Because when you really break it down, it says wealth should not be concentrated in the hands of a few. And the best place that I can think of in terms of having that particular philosophy become more acceptable by full-fledged Republicans are in fact what are known as shareholdings. Now, I want it understood as crystal clear as I can get it. I do not believe that our state should be making investments purely in speculative risks such as the S&P 500, NASDAQ, Dow Jones. Because those kinds of investments are very, very volatile, and that of course, would be a recipe for disaster in terms of putting our state's budgetary needs in jeopardy. But when it comes to shareholdings at private expense, and this, of course, is where a number of individuals who may have stock market portfolios that are either making dividends on either shareholdings or bonds and things like that, my understanding of the S&P 500 is that the S&P 500 would not be a fraction of what it is today if those shareholdings were not actually available for public trade. And that is essentially where the so-called redistribution of wealth takes place, but it also takes place in a way that is fair and reasonable, and it truly does amount to a fair amount of equity to be able to be gained from that particular standpoint. So shareholdings are, in my estimation, one of the best ways to be able to bridge that gap of communication between the Progressive Party and the Republican Party. And I will tell you, I have yet to meet a single Republican or even member of the legislature who identifies themselves as a Republican who is against shareholdings in terms of the preservation of capitalism, specifically as it relates to the S&P 500. Now, just to be clear about this one, some of my Republican critics watching this might think of that as being a stretch. And even some of my progressive critics might think of that as being a stretch as well. That is perfectly understandable. But again, this is, as far as shareholdings are concerned, this is really the only thing that I can think of that would essentially be able to have a ghost of a chance of bridging the gap of communication between the Progressive Party and the Republican Party in a way that is purely from a monetary perspective, and that's why I emphasize shareholdings. Again, shareholdings are definitely should be paid for in private expense, not at the expense of taxpayers or even the state for that matter, but it is a possibility that might be out there that might be worth looking into in different portions of and frankly, anywhere you can possibly think of in terms of monetary decisions are concerned. But that is not necessarily to get tied up with public service, and that's the key difference. Because again, we're talking about working with members of the legislature to represent the best of Vermonters. Okay, so that was definitely a gray area. So we're going to go ahead and we'll go down to the last one here, because this next one is really, really important. This is the end-all, be-all for this particular chart. Anyways, this is what really ties the parties together. The progressives write, quote, "We need to create an economy that is sustainable and reserves the destruction of our global environment." The key words to focus on: an economy that is sustainable. Let's focus on just that portion just for a second. The truth is that any time that it comes to the Treasurer's Office, for example, working with the legislature to create a stronger economy that is sustainable, you cannot essentially have an economy that is sustainable without sustainable investments. And I submit, actually, I can think of no registered Republican that would be against having an economy for our state that is, in fact, sustainable. But when it comes to the Progressive Party, again, these quotes right here, these philosophies, this is from the Progressive Party's website. So these are their words. These are not my words. And this, of course, is another major area that I do believe really connects the Progressive Party and the Republican Party together in terms of recognizing that if we want to have a sustainable economy and be able to make the best kinds of decisions that we can to benefit Vermonters, this is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of having a sustainable economy. But then it goes on to even further to say, reverses the destruction of our global environment. So as far as global environment is concerned, global is one thing, state is another. In terms of working with the state, our state does in fact appear to have a very, very low economic growth and development. And we essentially do not have the resources that the state of New York has, or the resources that the state of New Hampshire or even Massachusetts especially have. But that's okay in the short run, because that means that there's nowhere to go but up. That's the good news. However, anytime that it comes to making investments for a sustainable economy, what we really don't want to have is some kind of infrastructure or some kind of economic growth and development that destroys our state's environment. That's why I believe that the Treasurer's Office should do everything within reason to work with all members of the legislature to make sure that any kind of investment that's made, that the infrastructure itself is more consistent, or in other words, harmonizes with our state's environment. Now, I'll be very honest and openly admit that I do not claim to be an environmental expert. And for that matter, I don't even have a degree in economics. But when it comes to harnessing the power of teamwork to balance communication along all sides of the aisle to exchange ideas for innovation and creativity, that is one of the best ways that I know of that can play a tremendous role in terms of assisting our legislature with being able to make decisions as far as making investments that are much more sound to harmonize with our state's environment. And this, of course, does in fact apply to every single member of the legislature, registered Republicans, registered Democrats, Libertarians, Progressives, Moderates, Independents, and basically any kind of political affiliation that you can think of. So to the conservative critics, my question is as follows. How in the world are we, how is it conservative to be able to live in one of the most pristine and cleanest states in the nation if we're only going to have infrastructure or economic growth and development that destroys our state's environments? To my liberal critics, the question becomes, how in the world are we supposed to be able to have economic growth and development to create job opportunities if the restrictions that are passed through legislation become so restrictive that small businesses can barely gain the traction that they need to not just be able to hire employees, but also be able to do the things that they want to be able to do, which is contribute to a sustainable economy. Now, I ask those two questions openly and honestly to help one side of the aisle appreciate where the opposite side of the aisle is in fact coming from. As long as they're able to, when I say they, I mean the legislature, are able to recognize where their colleagues are coming from that are on opposite sides of the aisle, that opens the door for them to be able to find common ground, so that way they can concentrate on making better investments that benefit Vermonters while making sure that our state's environment is in fact reserved. And that is a really, really important thing to keep in mind because, again, we're talking about working with Mother Nature at that point, and we want to make sure that we are treating that our state's environment as fragilely as we possibly can. So that is something that's really important to keep in mind. So based on just these 5 philosophies here, I really can think of no better way to be able to emphasize the power of teamwork for the legislature to be able to work together. So with all of that in mind, why would I bring this to the attention of the voters? The real reason that I'm bringing this to the attention of the voters is because in terms of making investments, it's one thing to be able to talk about investments in terms of where funds should be allocated, and as far as that's, of course, prior to the Treasurer's Office issuing the bonds that I talked about in the last video. But in this video, we can talk numbers all day long, but if we don't have any sources of common ground to be able to work with all sides of the aisle, then frankly, we're really not going in the direction that we really want to as far as making investments are concerned to benefit Vermonters. So with that in mind, let's get into the more specifics about investments that are supposed to be benefiting Vermonters. And let's see if whether or not we can study the history of the predecessors that have come before us that have tried to enact certain kinds of investments that didn't quite necessarily go that they wanted them to. So that's why on the opposite side here, healthcare reform. As I mentioned in the last video, I do believe that healthcare and even housing for that matter should be recognized and treated as a human right. However, in terms of healthcare and even housing reform, that becomes a very, very different story. So let's go ahead and examine this chart just a little bit more closely. So we know for a fact that the state of Vermont currently does not have a single-payer healthcare system. Historically, the state did in fact pass one that was known as Act 48 in the year of 2011 to build the nation's first state-level single-payer system. And then Governor Peter Shumlin had actually abandoned the initiative in 2014, citing that there was an insurmountable tax increase and economic risks as well. So let's get into the more specifics. So currently, in what they originally did was they had what was known as something called Green Mountain Care. And it was envisioned as a publicly financed universal healthcare system that would replace the private insurance for all Vermont state residents. Here's where the failure really came in. Most estimates suggested that the program would cost anywhere between $1.6 and $2.5 billion, with a B, in just the very first year. To raise that money, property taxes would also have to be represented. And of course, there would go on to be an 11.5% payroll tax on employers and a 9.5% income tax. Okay, so let's just stop right there. That is an astronomically high percentage as far as an increase is concerned. They're talking above an 11%, almost a 12% increase. No wonder it was not sustainable. The real reason why they were unable to, and when I say they, I mean Governor Shumlin's administration, the real reason they were not able to be able to have a single-payer system is because it was hurting taxpayers in many different in many different regards. That was way too much for our state to be able to handle. So they literally could not handle that kind of an increase. So without boring you to tears reading all the technical jargon here, that was the real reason why a single-payer healthcare system had to be discontinued, because of the fact that there was what was known as the solvency of the state that was not necessarily addressed first. So again, the intention for a single-payer system was correct. The way that it was financed in terms of being able to responsibly finance healthcare reform, that was not thought through properly because of the solvency of the state. So how exactly does the solvency look on paper? Well, fortunately, I had another chart here that I was able to put together, and this comes off of truedata.com, so special thank you to them. Over here, the solvency, let's go ahead and just looking at the charts first and foremost. What this is really talking about is talking about a ratio. Let's just make sure that we understand what that we go through the ratio's definition. That it's a mathematical comparison that shows the relationship between two or more quantities, indicating how many times one value contains or is contained within another. So that's the textbook version of what a ratio is. But let's go ahead and see if we can apply that to solvency ratios. Now this, of course, is only for a business, or in other words, private sector model. But as I've talked about in the last video, I do believe that there is a way to be able to equate what I used to be doing in working in the private sector, and then have those models become more applicable to public service as well. Ultimately, in this case, of course, to benefit Vermonters. So when they talk about solvency, what they're really getting at is the best way to think about solvency is that you want your total assets to actually outweigh what are known as liabilities. So what exactly are liabilities? Liabilities can be thought of in many different ways. There are what are known as pensions, for example, which of course are severely underfunded, in my view, for the state of Vermont, for our state employees, including our teachers. And then in other cases, there are what are known as, like I said, healthcare costs. And in that particular case of the single-payer system, healthcare reform was not actually financed as well as it should have been, because again, there's no possible way that you can be able to keep up with an 11.5% payroll tax on employers, and of course a 9.5% income tax for individuals. And I would also I would like to stipulate that Vermont did expect to receive federal funding as well, federal support, but that didn't actually happen in the way that it was supposed to. So there was a massive deficit, massive decline as far as that was concerned as well. So that's one of the reasons why the best way to think about solvency is that when your assets outweigh your liabilities, liabilities also amount to what are known as financial obligations. So what really ends up happening is when your liabilities outweigh your assets that you have, in this particular case for the state, that doesn't do the solvency any favors. So that's why this chart says that a higher solvency ratio indicates stronger liquidity position for the company, but in this particular case, it's really about the state of Vermont. Meanwhile, a lower solvency ratio suggests that there is a higher risk of default on debt and obligations. So the higher the risk, and then that allows to higher debts, that is not a good way to be solvent. This is exactly the reason why the solvency of the state should be addressed first before other investment opportunities can be thought of. And this, again, I cannot emphasize enough. This is exactly the reason why in terms of running for the Treasurer's office, I am proposing for a collaborative banking system. Let's just review about a collaborative banking system just for a brief moment. it's a combination between state banks and partnership banks. So as we talked about in the last video, state banks do a tremendous job at retaining the capital gains within the state borders. But unfortunately for the Libertarian Party, that could lead to having a negative downside in terms of giving more power to the state and thereby increasing the size of the government as well. And of course, as we all know from President Ronald Reagan, as our government expands, our liberties contract. Partnership banks are different because those kinds of banking systems engage in the power of partnership. In other words, more power to the people, which of course is what the Libertarian Party is ultimately asking for, and that's a remarkable thing. So that is exactly the reason why we would want to have a collaborative banking system to combine both a state bank and a partnership bank together. In other words, fuse the two platforms together so that way it works for the benefit of the state of Vermont. And of course, that I can think of no better way to be able to address responsibly healthcare reform, because when you have a collaborative banking system that is generating revenue, and generates revenue tremendously, I might add, because again, with the partnerships that are established within that kind of banking system, that opens the door for strategic risk management, which also allows for smaller banks and even smaller businesses to participate in loans at much cheaper prices, and thereby that essentially creates jobs. And that's a wonderful thing. And then of course, that kind of partnership also gets retained within the state borders and then opens the door for other investment opportunities. So it's not necessarily just addressing the solvency of the state at that point, it's addressing the solvency of the state while also making sure that we have enough revenue generation to be able to meet our state liabilities, in other words, our state's financial obligations. And of course, healthcare reform, yes indeed. If we're going to be serious about recognizing it as a human right, healthcare reform would most certainly be one of those financial obligations. So then the chart goes even further to list solvency ratios and then explain why they are so important. So first of all, with solvency ratios, they excel at assessing financial stability of a company, but in this particular case, again, we're talking about applying the private sector to the state of Vermont. Then, of course, it goes on to protecting investments during economic downturns. So there are a lot of cases where, like we talked about, for example, with the estimations, and one of the reasons I believe estimations should be replace the word projections. But if you recall correctly from the last video, like we had in the month of February, for example, there was a case where the ROI was not as high at what was compared to what was acquired in the month of January, and that's because we had an economic downturn. Which in a lot of cases, in my understanding, are usually caused either by miscommunications or misunderstandings, and again, that defaults back on our state's government. But the good news is that when we have the solvency ratios formulas applied, we are able to defend those kinds of investments, and of course, yes indeed, the most formidable investment that the state could benefit from is in fact a collaborative banking system, but we also want to make sure that the banking system itself has enough defense to protect itself during the downturns as far as economics are concerned. But then the ratio goes even further to explain that it measures the risk and avoids financially weak companies, or in other words, financial weakness, and then to apply that to the state, of course, what I'm really getting at is increasing the fiscal strength of the state. So does increasing the fiscal strength of the state play an important role in terms of the solvency of the state? Absolutely, it does. And I submit actually that it's one of the cruxes of this particular formula right here, to making sure that we are not only able to increase the fiscal strength of our state, but also be able to allow for the solvency ratio to be able to work essentially work its magic, if you will, but becoming much more responsible with making sure that we have a much more sustainable economy, not just in a way that recklessly destroys our state's environment, but make investments that are much, much more consistent with our state's environmental needs as well. And this is one of the reasons why I cannot emphasize how important it is to address the solvency of the state, because even though, like I said, the intent for a single-payer system under Governor Shumlin's administration, the intent itself was correct, but the way that it was paid for, not so good. And that's because of the fact that there was not enough revenue generation to keep up with the percentage percentages that were being demanded to be able to cover the costs of that kind of reform. But then finally, the most important thing, the last but certainly not least, let's put it that way actually, for this for me here, making informed investment decisions. This is really where, once again, the rubber meets the road in terms of working with the legislature. This is exactly the reason why I began this particular presentation with talking about and even addressing what the Progressive Party was talking about in terms of their beliefs. And this is because, again, it's really important to find common ground, because the question at that point becomes, how in the world are we supposed to be able to make informed investment decisions if we don't have the power of teamwork on our side? And to go even further, that is also where having balanced communication comes in. This is exactly the reason why we want to have balanced communication with all members of the legislature, because that is going to open the door for teamwork and also for all members of the legislature to be able to find common ground. And then, of course, they can begin to work together in harmony. Why in the world, of course, would I bring this to the attention of the voters? Well, I bring this to the attention of the voters for a very, very specific reason. And that is because the voters have brought it to my attention that they believe that the two-party system is not working. And when I say these voters that I've conversed with, it's closer to, originally, in the very beginning, within the first 13 days of campaigning in terms of petitioning, that was over 500 voters. At this particular point in time, however, I have conversed with closer to 6,000 voters between Bennington and all the way up to Newport and every other community in between. These voters that I've conversed with have told me over and over again that they are so sick and tired of the Republican versus Democrat political divisiveness, not only not working in the favor of our state, but also taking a detrimental toll on our state's ability to govern as well. And I really can't say as I blame them at all, because they're having the most difficult time in the world communicating with the opposite side of the aisle, regardless of wherever they stand politically. So that's the reason why I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to be able to find common ground with all members of the legislature first, to then open the door for the power of teamwork, to then have teamwork evolve into coalitions and collaborations. And in this particular case, just like I talked about in the last video, collaborations that are so strong that it results in the formation of a collaborative banking system. And that is where making informed investment, as far as decisions are concerned, factor in the most. So now the question becomes, what kind of investments can we make once we have the power of teamwork to be able to truly and sincerely benefit our state, and most importantly, the people of our state? This chart over here exemplifies methods for increasing the state's fiscal strength. Now, just to be clear about the terminology for fiscal strength, what that really amounts to is government revenue and strategic assets. So first of all, and this chart actually does a very, very good job, and you can find all this information online, by the way. It's totally available on Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. For example, the very first one, it says bolster reserve funds, sharing the surpluses. I'm not going to bore you to tears with all the technical jargon, but basically what they're really getting at are what are known as rainy day funds. So, for example, when you have a collaborative banking system that is generating revenue via the synergy of compounded interest, a lot of times that interest can be allocated towards those kinds of funds that they're talking about in here in terms of rainy day funds. And usually, for the most part, they amount to emergency reserves. So in case there's a natural disaster, for example, you might recall a number of years ago we had Hurricane Irene. Just a couple of years ago we had COVID. Those are the kinds of funds that for all intents and purposes, those so-called rainy day funds are actually being allocated towards in terms of natural disasters or pandemics and things like that. But even then, can that money that's sitting in those reserves, can that earn interest as well? Well, absolutely it can, and that's why it says bolster reserve funds. I mean, they don't emphasize the word bolster reserve funds for nothing. So that's one of the reasons why they have it listed that way. Then, of course, we come down to diversity tax basis, and then it goes on to say enforced balanced budget rules. Oh my goodness gracious, how much more important can you get than that? Because when you have, what really ends up happening is that when you have balanced budget rules that are enforced, now we're actually making progress in terms of working with the legislature, because as I found out the hard way in terms of working in Tinsboro, Massachusetts, we really can't have a balanced budget unless we have balanced communication. So in this particular case, it's not just about overbearingly enforcing the budgetary rules for balancing purposes, it's more about balancing communication, so that way all members of the legislature are able to understand why those rules are being enforced in the way that they are. And that makes much more sense to not just all members of the legislature, but to all branches of the government. So that way the communication can be much, much more balanced. And again, when I say balance, it's not going to be perfectly in synchronization with one another via lock and key, but that does in fact open the door significantly for having balanced communication, which is really, really important in terms of meeting our state's budgetary needs, because the truth of the matter is when the balance, when the communication goes out of balance, guess what happens to the state's budget? Yep, you guessed it. The state's budget also goes out of balance. When you have communication among all members of the legislature that is massively out of balance, that takes a detrimental toll on our state's ability to be able to balance the budget as well. So that's why I cannot emphasize enough finding common ground as a starting point to be able to promote the power of teamwork with all members of the legislature. You can begin to see how this all goes hand in hand sequentially. So it really begins with finding common ground first, and then championing the foundations of finding common ground to have teamwork, that then leads to balanced communication, that then leads to what are known as coalitions and collaborations, that then continue from there. So again, like I said, it shouldn't be about, when it comes to enforcing these kinds of rules, it shouldn't be about overbearingly forcing the legislature to say, you need to understand this or understand that, or no. That's not what this is about at all. What this is really about is restoring balanced communication to the legislature for the power of unity. I think I've made that point pretty clear at this point, but I'm going to say it again throughout the course of the campaign until I'm blue in the face. Then, of course, it has the implement pay-go policies, and these rules ensure that any new spending increase on tax cuts are fully offset by corresponding revenue adjustments, once again, as in addressing the solvency of the state, and then, of course, goes into further to say avoiding unintended deficits. So, again, does this part right here tie into addressing the solvency of the state? Oh, absolutely it does. And then it goes even further to say modernize tax codes. I mean, there's no question in my mind that most registered Republicans would love to have a modernized tax code. I really can't say as I blame them. I think the Progressive Party would say the same thing as well. And so, and that of course leads to updating tax structures to capture revenue. And now look at this part here: from fast-growing emerging sectors, much like the digital economy and AI-driven data centers. My goodness gracious, that's where a collaborative banking system fits in right there, because of the fact that collaborative banking systems, they do in fact use the power of AI in a lot of different areas to help them strategize their most formidable investments. And does that generate revenue? Absolutely it does. It generates revenue almost at lightning speed, but then of course the revenue that's being generated then has to be managed responsibly. And that, of course, is where a state bank's polymerization comes into play with a partnership bank to make sure that this kind of banking system is indeed financially protected, but also has the power to be able to restore power to the people, financially speaking, as well as being able to satisfy the reforms that should be met for our state's budgetary needs. And that, of course, is how one of the ways, it's not the only way, but that's one of the major ways that I can think of to be able to address the solvency of the state, because you really can't have the solvency of the state be addressed without revenue generation. And then, of course, last but not least, for increasing the state's fiscal strength, targeted investments. Fostering long-term economic growth through strategic funding, in other words, strategic risk management, in infrastructure, vocational training, and high-quality education expands the state's overall tax base. What a concept. Now, let's just pause just for a brief moment. Does any of that, in terms of high-quality education, does any of that resonate just a little bit, even to the smallest degree, with Act 73? Yeah, same here. To me, I don't necessarily believe that it makes any sense to say to have Act 73 be the end-all, be-all say in terms of education reform, because we should remember what Governor Phil Scott said during his State of the State address, that education reform will never be perfect, and it will never also be complete. So it's constantly changing. The educational curriculums should constantly be adapting to meeting our state's, and not just our state, but also our society's future. So this is one of the reasons why I am a strong proponent in terms of opening the door for exploring investment opportunities for technical schools and trade schools, so that way our youth within our state can be able to learn hands-on and have much better education opportunities to be able to have high-paying jobs by the time that they graduate, or even acquire apprenticeships while they are still in these kinds of vocational training and educational programs. And then, of course, I submit actually that that's much, much more consistent with responsibly financing education reform, because that opens the door for what are known as sponsorships, which is a fantastic thing in my estimation, to be able to champion our youth and have our youth have the abilities, in other words, equal access to economic opportunities. So while the opportunities themselves are not exactly the same across the board, the point is that they do in fact have equal access to different economic opportunities in general, regardless of what they're what they specialize in as far as education is concerned. So this is one of the reasons why addressing the fiscal strength of our state is absolutely imperative, and again, it fits in very, very well with the formula that we talked about just a little bit earlier in terms of addressing the solvency of the state. But this is only generating revenue from the state internally. A lot of times people will ask the question, what about federal funding for the state? Well, that's where this next one chart comes in here. So federal funding for the state. Now you'll notice that in one fiscal year, and then just to be absolutely clear about what a fiscal year is, it's any consecutive 12-month period. And the organization uses to track its accounting, budgeting, and its tax reportings and so forth. So what that really means is that one full fiscal year does not actually necessarily mean that it goes from January 1st until December 31st, but it's a full 12 months. That leads from one year to the other. So the federal government provided $3.38 billion to the state of Vermont within the fiscal year of 2023. Now that is a lot of money for sure, $3.38 billion, and then of course this goes on to say that it includes money that's transferred to Vermont state government, as well as funds sent directly to local entities within the state, such as cities, school districts, and so forth. And of course, what they're really getting at are municipalities. The federal funding helps the state and local governments to pay for things like the infrastructure, education, and health care for low-income Vermonters. What a tremendous concept. So this is part of where the legislature really picks up in terms of being able to have access to those kinds of funds they talk about, and then be able to benefit Vermonters based on the investments they're taking in from the federal government. This, again, is where the Treasurer's Office comes into play, because I can't say enough, there's a massive difference between responsibly investing these kinds of funds versus recklessly investing these kinds of funds. We want to have these specific kinds of funds that they're really getting at to be allocated from the legislature to be invested responsibly. And that is something that I really cannot emphasize enough, because we don't want to have any kind of reckless investing. So with the couple minutes that I do have left, what I do want to focus on, housing. Not just any housing, but housing from a much, much larger perspective in terms of investing. And of course, I'm getting at real estate investment trusts. I do realize I'm running out of time here, so I'll try to go through this relatively fast. But in any case, they're also known as REITs. They're companies that you specifically can actually invest in that purchase real estate, and those properties are often rented out and they produce income. So imagine an opportunity where you specifically can be able to own real estate without actually owning real estate. And again, this is where shareholdings comes into play, like we've talked about with finding common ground between the Progressive Party and the Republican Party, as far as the wealth not being concentrated in just a handful of people, but also having the ability to share in terms of shareholdings. REITs may distribute up to 90% of their income to their investors, in other words, their shareholders, in the formation of dividends. 90%. That is unbelievable. So does that essentially allow for some so-called wealth to be redistributed? Absolutely it does. And these shares, again, are available for public trade. But when you have a REIT, a real estate investment trust, that is issuing 90% or anywhere up to 90%, even to issue up to 30% of their total profits to shareholders in formations of dividends, my goodness gracious, I mean, that's a tremendous source of wealth right there. I don't see any reason why a collaborative banking system couldn't participate in that. And that, of course, leads to the development of Section 8 housing, by the way, which I would assume, rightfully imagine, that a lot of government-backed mortgage security should be able to take place, which again is part of the package of being able to recognize housing as a human right, but also creating jobs as well for other investment opportunities. And then, of course, it even says, like I mentioned before, REITs are an easy way to invest in real estate without having to own property yourself. So you don't actually have to own the properties. You can, in fact, purchase these shareholdings, which are all available for public trade, and receive a tremendous amount of dividends as well. So that becomes an incredibly formidable, very, very powerful and formidable investment for the state of Vermont, because again, we've got to address the solvency of the state first if we're going to recognize housing or even healthcare as a human right, and then make sure that it's responsibly paid for. This is one of the ways to be able, in my estimation, to be able to do it. So finally, REITs do, in fact, they have very, very, very steady dividends. They also have high returns on investment. And the liquidity is also listed as well because they are publicly traded and they are much easier to buy and sell than actually go through the laborious process of actually buying, managing, and selling commercial properties, because that's all taken care of electronically, and sometimes that looks like an ETF. It's very similar to an ETF, or in other words, an exchange-traded fund, but it's a little bit different, but the principles are relatively similar. Not exactly the same, but they are very, very similar. And then finally, lower volatility, just like the bonds that we talked about in the last video. The lower the volatility is, the much better the investment itself is. That is why the word trust is attached to real estate investment trust, in other words, REITs. Okay, I'm almost out of time. I will leave you with this, however. Again, what I have shown you today, these examples, these models, these are not the end-all, be-all perfect solutions. However, I do believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that they can serve as a model that our legislature can take to champion the power of teamwork. So in this particular case, thank goodness that the Treasurer's Office is completely apolitical. In other words, it's not a policymaking position. It's purely monetary and finances, but that's only half the battle. The other half of the battle is working with human beings, specifically members of the legislature and every other individual that you can think of involved with our state's government. To my two opponents, Mr. H. Brooke Page, who's running as a Republican, and to Mr. Mike Pichek, our current state treasurer, who's running for re-election as a Democrat. If the both of you are watching this video, I openly welcome the both of you to a debate at your discretion. And I'm looking forward to running against you. And I'm looking forward to running against you fairly. Of course, I'm looking forward to seeing how your campaigns play out over the next couple of months. To every voter that's out there, if you are a registered Republican, registered Democrat, Libertarian, Progressive, Moderate, or Independent, or even a socialist, I am asking for your vote because I believe in the power of teamwork. That's to that magnitude. If you're an undecided voter, I am also asking for your vote. In this particular campaign that I'm running, it's not about Republicans versus Democrats. It is about teamwork. And I'm going to be saying the word teamwork as often as I possibly can. So with all of that in mind, I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this presentation. And I sincerely hope that you enjoyed the most recent presentation that I gave when I was here a couple of weeks ago. With all of that said, let's make a change for our brave little state. Thank you so very much.